Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Schizophrenics of Internet, what is the scariest hallucination that you have ever experienced? Story 1. Hallway of Darkness.
In college, I had a friend who was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, though I did not know it at the time. One night, we were hanging out in his dorm room. It was late, probably around 11 p.m. or midnight, when he got up to go to the bathroom. As he opened the door to the hallway, he froze, staring into what seemed to be an empty corridor. His expression immediately changed, and he asked me to come to the door and tell him if I noticed anything unusual. Confused, I walked over to where he was standing and looked down the hall. The lights were fully on, and nothing seemed out of place. I told him so. That was when his voice trembled as he asked, "Can you hear that?" I strained my ears but heard nothing. "No," I replied. He looked at me, his face pale and his hands shaking. He said he could hear muffled crying or arguing coming from down the hall, though I still heard nothing. What terrified me even more was when he said the hallway was completely black, pitch black. To him, it was not just dimly lit or shadowed, but engulfed in total darkness, despite the fact that I could see it was fully illuminated. His fear was palpable, and it began to rub off on me. I had no idea he was unwell, and in that moment, his panic felt contagious. We were both on the verge of tears, unsure of what to do. In an effort to comfort him, I walked him to the bathroom. The hallway seemed perfectly normal to me, but he remained deeply shaken, insisting he could still hear crying echoing around us. Afterward, I stayed in his room for the night, unable to leave him alone in such a state. For years, I thought he might have been playing a prank, but soon after that incident, he began therapy and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He started medication, which helped him immensely. Looking back, I realized that what happened that night was not a joke or an exaggeration. It was a terrifying, very real experience for him and for me. It was an unsettling brush with a reality I could not fully understand.
Story 2. Whispers in the Dark.
I have psychosis, and it tends to be at its worst when I am alone or at night. The combination of the two, being alone at night, is especially challenging. One of the most frightening experiences I ever had occurred while I was house training my puppy. It was around 3 a.m., and I had taken him outside. As I stood in the stillness of the night, I suddenly noticed a group of figures in the distance. They appeared to be members of a hooded group like the Ku Klux Klan, standing alongside witches, gathered as if performing a séance. The sight alone was unnerving, but then I began to hear faint whispers carried in the night air. The whispers were chilling, filled with fragmented words that hinted at violence. I distinctly heard the word killing among the murmurs. My heart raced as I realized the group was no longer standing still. They were walking up the street, heading directly toward my house. I froze in terror, clutching my puppy tightly. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing and hearing. Were they really there? Was I in danger? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Thankfully, that moment passed without further incident. I went back inside and tried to calm down. In hindsight, I understand that it was one of the most severe hallucinations I have ever experienced. brought on by the isolation and stress of the situation. Nowadays, my episodes are far less intense. When I am stressed, I may see fleeting shadows in the corner of my vision or experience brief moments of unease, but they are much easier to ignore. Still, that night remains etched in my memory as a deeply unsettling reminder of how real and terrifying psychosis can feel.
Story 3. The Faceless Ones.
First, let me start by saying that I experience hallucinations categorized as psychosis rather than schizophrenia. The distinction is made when the symptoms do not fully align with or are not severe enough for a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia. That said, some of my hallucinations have been terrifying enough to make me physically react in fear. I cannot even imagine how difficult it must be for those whose symptoms are worse. My scariest hallucination will always be my first visual one. It happened when I was in 10th grade. I had already been hearing voices for a while, to the point where I was beginning to get used to hearing things others could not. It was unsettling, but I had learned to cope. However, nothing could prepare me for what I saw that day. I remember getting up from my desk to use the bathroom. The hallways were quiet and empty as I stepped outside the classroom. That was when I saw him. A man with no face was standing a short distance away, directly facing me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked a couple of times and shook my head, expecting him to vanish. When I looked back, he was gone. I felt a wave of relief, convincing myself it was nothing. After all, how could he have moved without me hearing anything in those silent hallways? I shrugged it off and headed toward the bathroom. When I reached the doorway, my heart sank. He was there again, standing motionless, blocking the entrance. This time I could not dismiss it. I froze, staring at him, unsure of what to do. Trying to rationalize it, I told myself he must be wearing a mask. Summoning some courage, I asked him to step aside and let me in. Just then, another student walked out of the bathroom and asked me who I was talking to. To my horror, the other student walked right through the faceless man as if he were not there. I stood there, speechless, feeling the blood drain from my face. The student gave me a strange look and walked away, leaving me alone with the figure. Slowly, the faceless man moved aside, allowing me to enter. I kept my eyes on him as I entered the bathroom, but the terror only escalated. Moments later, a girl walked in. At first, I was about to tell her she was in the wrong bathroom, until I realized she too had no face. They both began walking toward me, silent and menacing. At that moment, panic overtook me. I ran into a stall, locked the door, and broke down. I stayed there, trembling and crying, until school staff came to talk me out. To this day, the faceless man and woman still appear from time to time. They never do anything, but their presence is always chilling. That first encounter, however, will always remain the most terrifying.
Story 4. Demons He Saw.
I remember responding to a call about a patient with schizophrenia. The man was off his medication, and from the moment we arrived on scene, he was in full-blown crisis. He was screaming, terrified, and trying to escape from something unseen. He kept shouting that demons were emerging from the ground, their hands reaching up to grab him. The things they were saying to him, the obscenities, only seemed to make him more frantic. When we arrived, the scene was chaotic. people in the area were watching in fear as the man shouted about the demons closing in on him. His hallucinations were so vivid, so real to him, that he couldn't tell the difference between reality and his delusions. It was clear that he was in deep distress, but what happened next caught me off guard. Once we approached him with the ambulance and he saw our uniforms, everything changed. The panic in his eyes started to subside. His breathing slowed and he began to recognize us as medical professionals. He stopped yelling, his body still tense, but no longer frantic. He became fully cooperative, even though his mind was still trapped in a world of demons and unseen horrors. I asked him, "Are you having hallucinations?" He responded, "Yup," and then began to describe them in chilling detail. His calmness was unsettling, especially when he added, "This is normal when I'm off my medication and I know I'm in an ambulance." The cold realization hit me hard. For this man, being surrounded by terrifying visions and hallucinations was his normal. And even more disturbing, he had learned to function through it. His terror was something he lived with, and it was so deeply ingrained in him that it seemed almost routine.
Story 5. Fear of being targeted.
One Friday evening, I was watching television and happened to be playing with a flashlight that I had left on the coffee table. Suddenly, I was in a full-blown hallucination. I heard a special forces team outside my window, as if they were sneaking through my backyard. I flashed the light around the room, and they became quiet. They misunderstood my intent, thinking the light was mounted on a rifle. Before I knew it, they were calling me outside as part of a SWAT response. I found myself on my hands and knees on my porch in the middle of the night, begging them not to shoot me. I must have stayed out there for about 2 hours, with my hands locked behind my head, as the snipers became more and more nervous about what I might do. Eventually, they decided there was no way to defuse the situation, and they shot me. I spent about 5 minutes lying dead on my front porch, then crawled inside my house to die. I called my mom to let her know that I'd been shot and that special forces had killed me. Needless to say, she didn't believe it, and she talked me down to reality a little bit. But that wasn't the end of it. She had me go to the emergency room and stayed on the phone with me until I arrived. I was still deep in hallucination mode, so while I was waiting in the emergency room, I overheard the leader of the SWAT Forces unit chatting with the front desk nurse. He knew I was there, and he was coming to get me. Fortunately, the doctor found me first and didn't really know what to do with me, so he gave me 2 milligrams of Ativan and discharged me. I drove home, still hallucinating and now somewhat affected by the Ativan, and I saw all sorts of strange things on the way home. Once I got home, the Ativan mellowed the hallucinations into something more pleasant, and I spent the rest of the weekend with playful hallucinations. I can't really describe the fear of having special forces snipers aiming at you for 2 hours straight.
Story 6. Echoes of the mind.
The scariest experience I've had is probably the most unsettling and eerie. And yet, it's the kind of thing that can happen to anyone, only it's much worse when you know what's happening isn't real. It happens when I'm completely alone in my house, the silence is suffocating, and I hear my name. It's faint at first, but clear enough to make me freeze in place. Someone is calling for me from another room. I know that there's no one else here, but the voice seems so real. I get up, cautiously walking through the house, checking every room to find no one. The house remains empty and the echo of my name lingers in the air like a whisper that's just out of reach. Then there are the strange noises. My audible hallucinations don't often form words, but they aren't quiet either. They sound like someone doing an odd jazz scat, a chaotic jumble of nonsensical sounds that make the hairs on my neck stand up. It's like the room is full of muffled voices, but there's no one around. It's unsettling, and it gets harder to ignore when I'm trying to sleep. The rhythm of it echoes in my head, keeping me awake for hours, wondering if the next sound will be worse. The visual hallucinations aren't any better. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone standing just outside a window, but when I look again, they're gone. It's like they were never there at all. Other times, small shadows scurry around, like mice, but they aren't mice. They move too fast, disappearing too quickly. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but it's hard to ignore. Every time I see those shadows darting across the floor, it feels like something is watching me, and it makes the whole house seem so much darker. I'm fortunate that my symptoms are relatively mild compared to others, but in those moments, in the quiet of the house, when the shadows seem too real and my name keeps echoing through the halls, it's hard to feel safe. It's terrifying knowing the mind can create such vivid things that feel as real as anything in the world.
Story 7. Fear of what's not there.
I'm not schizophrenic, but I do experience psychotic episodes. These episodes bring with them hallucinations that tend to stay within one sense. But sometimes they blur together, creating an overwhelming experience. One of the most common hallucinations I deal with is seeing bugs crawling on surfaces where there is nothing. I'll stare at the smooth, clear surface, and then there they are, tiny, wriggling creatures skittering about. I try to squish them, but nothing happens. My hand passes through empty space, but the feeling of something crawling under my skin doesn't stop. It's as if my mind creates the sensation of bugs even when they aren't really there. That physical sensation alone is enough to make my skin crawl, my body tense in terror. But the worst one, the scariest hallucination, happened in my bedroom. I woke up in the middle of the night to find a body lying on the floor at the foot of my bed. At first it seemed like an ordinary sight, but then I heard it, wheezing. It was coming from the body, this lifeless, still figure that I couldn't explain. The sound of each breath rasping in and out was so clear, it felt like it was happening in the very air around me. I wanted to move, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The wheezing continued, louder and more disturbing with each passing second. I had to look away, but when I did, the sound echoed in my head, clinging to me like a persistent nightmare. I couldn't bring myself to check if the body was real or just another hallucination. My heart raced with the primal fear of the unknown, my mind fighting to make sense of the situation. For me, each sense impacts me differently when it comes to hallucinations. Hearing something is distracting, often annoying, but it doesn't fill me with fear, not anymore. I've grown used to the strange whispers and unintelligible sounds that invade my mind. But seeing something, especially something like that body, takes my fear to a whole new level. It taps into a deeper, more visceral part of me, the part that feels the danger, even when I know it's not real. And tactile hallucination. They are the worst. The sensation of something crawling on me or the feeling of a cold, invisible hand brushing my skin makes my stomach churn with panic. I'm thankful it's never happened before that a hallucination has consumed all of my senses at once. I'm not sure I could handle it. The thought of being overwhelmed by my own mind of feeling, seeing, hearing, and even smelling something that isn't there terrifies me. If that day comes, I'm not sure how I'll cope. I can only hope I never have to find out.
Story 8. Night of the Shadows.
I once cared for a patient who had Lewy body dementia. It wasn't schizophrenia, but the hallucinations she experienced were absolutely terrifying. I worked the night shift, and my office was close to her room. Every night, without fail, she would scream loud, agonizing screams that echoed through the halls. I'd go into her room, sit with her, and gently ask her what was scaring her. The things she described were enough to haunt anyone's mind. She would say she saw people hiding in the shadows in the corners of her room, watching her. She could hear them laughing, a twisted, mocking sound that made her skin crawl. Sometimes the faces of these shadowy figures would contort and shift into horrific, distorted shapes. The terror she felt was palpable, but the worst part came when she described what she felt crawling on her body. She felt rats, small, scurrying rats crawling up and down her body, but it didn't stop there. She could feel them burrowing into her, clawing their way under her skin, biting her from the inside. She would scream in horror as she felt them coming out through her eyes, the sensation almost too much to bear. Despite these tormenting hallucinations, she remained lucid for much of the time, able to have clear, coherent conversations, even making jokes and showing a surprising sense of humor. She knew what she was seeing and feeling weren't real, but that knowledge didn't make the experience any less terrifying for her. Over time, though, the lines between reality and hallucination blurred. She began to lose her grip on what was real, and the torment grew even worse. She passed away a few months ago, and though I miss her terribly, I'm grateful that her suffering has finally ended. I spent 2 years with her, listening to her terrifying accounts and offering comfort in whatever way I could. It's hard to forget the horror she endured, but in some way, knowing she's no longer trapped in that world of nightmares brings me some peace.
Story 9. Living in Fear.
Lewy body dementia is a cruel condition, and I had a first-hand experience of just how terrifying it can be. I work in a physical therapy clinic, and one of our patients, a sweet lady with osteoarthritis, was diagnosed with it while she was receiving treatment. Her main complaint was knee pain, which seemed typical for her condition. But the more she talked, the more disturbing her delusions became. She was convinced that there were 2 men who drove an hour every night just to target her. She believed they were coming to her house, specifically to kick her in the knees. Despite the fact that there were no signs of trauma, her mind clung to this belief with utter certainty. The fear she described in her voice, the paranoia in her eyes, it was enough to make anyone feel unsettled. But it didn't stop there. She also believed that these men were poisoning her dog, sabotaging her shoes by poking holes in them, and throwing away important paperwork. To everyone else, her accusations seemed nonsensical, absurd even, but to her, they were the terrifying truth. She couldn't understand why her doctor had diagnosed her with Lewy body dementia. She couldn't make sense of it. How could something so unbelievable be happening to her? What made it worse was how lucid she seemed when discussing everything else. She was sweet, articulate, and easy to talk to. But whenever she spoke about those two men, her face would twist with fear and confusion. She fully believed they were real. Her mind had turned her torment into a vivid, terrifying reality. It was heart-wrenching to witness, watching someone struggle with such fear and confusion, and knowing there was nothing we could do to convince her otherwise. Her mind had trapped her in a nightmare that felt just as real as any physical injury.
Story 10. Faceless Visitor.
I've been living with schizoaffective disorder for a number of years. 2 years ago, I tried ending my life. During my recovery, I wasn't placed in a psych ward, but I was still hospitalized. My mind and body were exhausted, and I found it incredibly difficult to stay awake for any significant amount of time. One afternoon, I woke up in my hospital room, my body heavy from the medication and the toll everything had taken on me. But something felt different. As my eyes opened, I immediately realized something was wrong. There, standing beside my bed, was an unnaturally tall figure. He was dressed in an all-black suit, the kind you might expect a businessman to wear, but his presence was far from normal. The figure was leaning over me, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It was as if the air around me had thickened, and my heart began to race. I could feel every hair on the back of my neck standing up. My body froze, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that he had come for me. I looked up at his face, but there was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. It reminded me of Slenderman, the unsettling, faceless figure I had heard about in stories. My mind tried to comprehend what I was seeing, but all I could feel was an instinctual terror. I had never been more certain in my life that this was the end. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the horrifying presence. But my screams broke through, louder than I had ever screamed before. I called for help, my voice raw and desperate. Nurses rushed into the room, struggling to calm me down as I thrashed about, my body trembling with fear. They fought to restrain me, to bring me back to reality. But part of me still couldn't shake the thought. What if this wasn't just a hallucination? What if it was something far more sinister, something beyond my mind's grasp? Even now, I wonder if that figure was truly just a figment of my mind, or if it was a reaper come to take my soul. I try not to think about it too much, but the doubt lingers, a shadow that never quite goes away.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.